Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is Shannon Scully with the Vera Institute of Justice's Center on Victimization and Safety. But we're going to wait a few moments and let a few more people join us, but while we're doing that, if you could take some time to answer the 2 poll questions that are on your screen. We just would like to get to know who you are in our audience today. So take a moment to do that, and we will begin in a few moments. It looks like a number of you have responded to our poll questions. The first is that we wanted to know what your primary area of work was. We have a number of domestic and sexual violence advocates on the line today, a few in the healthcare field, and many of the above. And it also looks like we have a few people who are new to working in the area of disability. And also a number of you out there who have been working in this field for a long time, so we welcome you all. I'm just going to go through and take a moment to go through a couple of our logistical items, so feel free to continue to answer these poll questions, but I do want to get us going here today so we can make sure we get through this exciting presentation this afternoon. First of all, we'd like your assistance in testing our captioning pod. The captioning pod is located at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. It's directly below the 2 poll questions. The words I'm speaking should appear in that captioning pod. If you can see the captioning, could you please go ahead and raise your virtual hand using the virtual person at the top of your screen. Okay, great. It looks like there's a number of you that you can see it. If you cannot see the captioning, please send us a message in the Q&A pod, which is just to the right of the poll questions and right below my business card on the screen there. You can let us know, and the staff from the Vera Institute are online today helping us with some technical assistance, so they'll be able to support you in getting that captioning pod to work if you need it. Participants are also in listen-only mode, which means we are not able to hear you, but you should be able to hear us. If you cannot hear the presenters speaking, if you cannot hear me speaking, if you're having any difficulties with the captioning or other technical difficulties during the presentation, again, please enter a message in the question pod to the right of the PowerPoint. Again, this is going to be the best way to communicate with myself or any of my Vera colleagues who are supporting on technical assistance today. We plan on having time after the presentation for questions and comments. If you don't want to lose your question or comment that may come up during the presentation, please feel free to enter it again into the question pod to the right of your screen, and our staff will hold that to the end for our presenter to answer. I'd also like to take a moment to remind all of our participants to participate in positive self-care. While the topics we present in our Bridging the Gap webinar series are important, we also recognize that they can be very difficult, especially on top of a lot of the work that many of you do day to day. If you need to step away from the presentation, please do so. All of our recordings here at the Center on Victimization and Safety are recorded, and we will be sending out recordings of that presentation after today. And so if you do need to step away for your care, you can go back and you can listen to this recording at your convenience. Again, we would also be offering your ability to download a copy of today's presentation, which you can do so by going to the pod in the upper right-hand corner, which will be on your next screen. You can click on the words and then press the download presentation button, and you can get a copy of that. But we will also, again, along with this recording, be sending out the PowerPoint in an email following this. All right, let us begin. Transgender and gender nonconforming individuals experience extremely high rates of violence as well as live with higher than average rates of physical and mental health conditions. In this webinar, we will be exploring the barriers and experiences of transgender survivors with disabilities through information and statistics about who they are and the types of violence they experience. Participants are also going to have an opportunity to learn about constructive and practical strategies for working with this multiply marginalized population. We are very excited today to have Michael Munson, who is the Executive Director of Forge, which is a national training and technical assistance provider funded through the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. Munson's educational background is in psychology with an emphasis on trauma-informed care and non-traditional healing modalities. His work on violence against transgender and gender nonconforming individuals stresses the intersectionality between complex components of identity, experience, and societal constructs that can both spur violence as well as catalyze healing for individuals and communities. He's passionate about engaging professionals to embrace these complexities and learn key skills to better serve their clients. And we are excited to have Michael with us today. So Michael, I will go ahead and turn this over to you.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. This is really exciting to be on one of Vera's webinars and getting to share this data with everybody that's on the call today. So you've done a lot of the prep work for me, so thank you for the great introduction, and again, thank you for asking Forge to be part of today's webinar. And you also have taken care of the first slide here, which is the general welcome and housekeeping that I normally do, but you captured it really well by talking about positive self-care. So, you know, again, the PowerPoints are available and the recording is going to be available, so please interact and take care of yourself in the best ways that you can. So let me start out and tell you a little bit about who Forge is so that we kind of get the nitty-gritty out of the way first, and then you'll know what we have to offer you. So in the long run, you can access what we have for you. Forge, like Shannon said, is a national transgender organization that's 100% funded to focus on anti-violence issues related to transgender survivors. You can look at it another way, too, which is that we're an anti-violence agency that's solely focused on trans issues. We were founded in 1994, so we've been around for 21 years, so a fairly long period of time. And we're headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which doesn't mean a whole lot since most of our work is national. Around 75% of our time and effort is spent working with providers and doing training and technical assistance. And then about the other 25% of our staff time is devoted to working directly with transgender and gender nonconforming survivors and loved ones who've experienced sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and hate-motivated crimes. So we have two foundational principles, and hopefully you will see them playing out in our time together today. The first is that we try to look at things through a trauma-informed lens, and that's always kind of a moving target, so we're always trying to stay as up-to-date as we can. And we try to work in a trauma-informed way, both with the training and technical assistance that we provide, as well as with the survivors that we serve. And the second foundational principle is on empowerment. And I think a lot of us think about that. We want to empower our clients and we want to empower survivors, but we also look at it as we want to empower you who are providing services to victims. So we want to help you do your job better because we know that you do your job well already, so we just want to add that additional layer of how do you work better with transgender survivors. So let me give you a quick rundown of what we can offer, and again, this is for your later use of if you want to contact us or if you want to access more in-depth training or in-depth services. So again, most of our work is on training and technical assistance, and that can take the form of one-on-one support. So we answer anything from one simple email to a very complicated set of problems. We have a lot of webinars archived and recorded, just like Vera does. Ours focus all on transgender issues and some of those other intersections. We do trainings across the country at conferences and other places that ask us to come and train. We have many hundreds of pages of publications, which I encourage you to check out as well on our website. And in the next week or so, you'll be hearing about a really exciting demonstration project that we'll be beginning. So that's the training and technical assistance side. We also want to make sure that you all know about what kinds of support that we offer to transgender survivors. And some of those are just kind of the simple housekeeping things of having a listserv that's available to anybody to connect one-on-one, so trans survivors and loved ones to connect 24/7. We have a lot of referrals, and we try to be as good as possible in getting people on our referral list that are both trans-informed and trauma-informed, and we would love to have some of those other sections of referral knowledge as well, so like how many people are disability informed. You'll be seeing today some photos from the Esparvo Project, so I'll explain a little bit more about that as we move forward. And again, directly for survivors, we have quite a few publications online that are geared towards survivors as well as geared towards providers. And I encourage you to check out where we are on social media, because it will keep you up to date about what's coming out, what's new. So if you'd like to stay more informed about trans and violence issues, that's a good place to start. And if you're live tweeting, please tag us so we can share your word as well. Like Vera, we are also funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, and we're always grateful for their support in allowing us to continue to do this work. So thank you to them. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of talk a little bit about some transgender basics so that we're all roughly on the same page. We'll move into talking about intersections, so those intersections of transness, disability, and trauma, which is, obviously going to be pervasive throughout our entire time today. We'll spend a lot of time talking about data, and I realized after I finished setting this up that there is quite a lot of data that's presented, so hopefully that'll be blended in enough with some stories, and we have 2 clips, audio clips of stories. So hopefully that'll give you a good idea with the stories and the data. And then we'll wrap up with some reminders and resources and then head into some questions. So let's set the stage a little bit. There's a couple of caveats that I'd like to kind of set up before we get into the nitty-gritty of things. And so the first is around reclaiming and respecting language, and in particular person-first language. Many of us are encouraged to use person-first language, and in fact, I've run into people and agencies and educational institutions that really have person-first language as the centrality of what people are expected to do. And I'm really, really glad to see that there's this continued shift from pathologizing to recognizing that people are people first. And this often translates, as most of you know, to shifting from language of disabled person to person with a disability. However, we know that sometimes people who are disabled or who are transgender may view those parts of their lives or parts of who they are as more central. And so they might have reclaimed some of those components and actually want to put that first. For some transgender people, people of transgender histories or identities, they might place that identity, again, in a little bit more central part of their life. So they may identify as trans men or trans women. So in a person-first language, that would be person who is trans, and sometimes that doesn't fit well for some trans folks. So I will do my best to kind of blend the 2 of those language styles, and hopefully people will be kind to me and understand the intent of trying to honor both of those types of thinking and how people identify themselves. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and this is from Lynn Fraser, who is a past president of WPATH, which is this kind of regulating body for transgender health. And she said this quote at a conference a couple years ago. She said, "No one's identity is a disorder." And I think that's really critical when we talk today about this intersection between transness and disability and trauma, all 3 of which oftentimes get labeled as a disorder. But when we look at people's identities, their identities are not a disorder. Sometimes it's hard to have clear lines about what a subject is, and transgender issues is one of those areas. Sometimes there's some blurry lines about how we look at things and how we see things. So I'd like you to keep in mind a couple of ideas about where and how the lines might be a little bit blurry. So the first thing is around the hierarchy of who is transgender. So sometimes we hear within the trans community and outside of the trans community this hierarchy of who's trans enough to be considered trans. A second thing is around where the lines between claimed identity, claimed trans identity, and perceived transness are. So by this I mean, can somebody state that they have a trans identity and not necessarily be noticed or visible to other people? Or can people have a perceived identity as trans by other people, but they don't identify as trans themselves? So that can be a little bit of a blurry line. And the last point on this slide is around the medicalization of transness versus transness as an identity or an experience or as a social construct. So in other words, people can have a medical diagnosis of gender identity disorder or transsexuality or gender dysphoria, but do the therapists and physicians look at transgender issues in that medical or pathologized way, or can transness be viewed as solely and as, as an identity or an experience that is not medicalized or assigned to a specific diagnosis? So let's look at some of those blurred lines around disability, since I think there's some similarities around where the blurriness is. So one of those areas is, where is the line between disability and health disparities? So what this might mean is that a person may say that she has a disability, but somebody else may say that she belongs to a group with a health disparity. So second thing is where is the line between perceived disability and claimed disability? So some people may determine that someone has a disability either because the disability is visible to others or because they have specific medical knowledge about the person. However, not all people with specific medical or mental health conditions will identify or state that they have a disability. For example, people who live with chronic conditions like arthritis may be perceived to have a disability, but that person living with arthritis may not view their reality as a disability. And the last point on this slide of kind of blurring the lines around disability is where and how does the line shift when we bring in multiple variables like income, access to health care, education, and family support. And this might seem a little bit out of place compared to the other 2 points on this slide, but what I mean here is where and how does disability change if we add the intersections of things like income or access to services? So one example could be like if we take a vet who comes back from an armed conflict and comes back without one leg, that veteran probably has access to medical care that some other people may not have if they had the same type of injury or disability. So their lives might look really different when one person has access to care or has the income to have things like prosthetic limbs versus living their life with crutches or a wheelchair. Another example could be somebody who has traumatic brain injury, and if somebody has a lot of support around them, that's going to look very different for them living with traumatic brain injury than if they don't have that support network around them. So I just wanted to make one caveat around language substitution. I know, again, when we're talking about person-first language and we're talking about lots of different kinds of language throughout, I know that we have a lot of people from different backgrounds, so please feel free to kind of mentally substitute language that better fits you, the people that you serve, or the field that you're in. So the image on the slide right now is of two people embracing, and they're part of the Esparvo Project, which is a photographic and narrative project that helps trans survivors and loved ones take a position of empowerment and healing and resilience. So you'll see many of their photos today as we move along, and of course we have their permission to use their images, and we're really grateful for them literally putting themselves out there. So let's move on and talk about who trans people are. I know that the description of this webinar said that we wouldn't talk a lot about 101 issues, but we want to make sure that we have some basic concepts covered so that we're all kind of knowing who we're talking about and talking about the same things. So if we can go ahead and start with a poll. The question for the poll is, what percentage of the population is transgender? So what do you think the population is of transgender people? So I'm guessing that most of you can see the screen as well, so it looks like many of you are picking 1.7% versus 0.5 or 3.0. And more of you are now selecting 3.0. Great. So it looks like we have answers in all three categories, which is perfect. Can we switch back to the PowerPoint? Thank you. So the answer is it really depends. We really don't know how many people are transgender because we don't have any scientific way of finding that out. But we have some researchers who have made some attempts at guessing what the percentage of the population is who is transgender. So the Williams Institute is out of UCLA, and they have done research that's found that around 0.3% of the population is transgender. And there are other researchers like Lynn Conway who believe that it's more like 1% or even greater than 1% of the population is transgender. So we really don't know, and it kind of depends on how we're defining transgender. Are we looking at people who are transitioning from one gender to another, who are accessing medical services, or are we talking about a broader range of people that include gender nonconforming people and others? We generally use a 1% as the prevalence rate, and it seems to be the most commonly used. So I just wanted to give you an idea of how many trans people are in the U.S. So if the U.S. population is around 300 million people, that means that 1% would be 3 million transgender people in the U.S., give or take. It's nearly impossible in 2015 for us to kind of move through the world and not have a concept of who transgender people are. I think we used to have a kind of more disengaged concept of who trans people were, but today we have a lot of media and things like Caitlyn Jenner, who has been on TV, and people like Laverne Cox who have been on TV. A lot of us are having contact with people who are transgender, even if they're just in the media. And many of us are having contact with trans people like when we have kids and they're in school districts and there's discussion around trans inclusion in grade schools or middle schools or high schools. A lot of us have worked with clients who are transgender or have family members who are transgender. So we all have, I think we almost all have some sense of who we're talking about, at least in some small way. And I'm hoping that by the end of today, you'll have a more fleshed out or a more thorough or a more expanded concept of who transgender people are. And I just want to be really clear from the get-go that we're talking about a really broad range of people, and I'll share with you a little bit more about who we're talking about. So one of the things at Forge that we try not to do is to define specific terms and give them definitions, because we find that when we apply labels to certain people's identities or experiences, rather than fully understanding who that person is, we're just putting the label on and we're trying to memorize that label. So we really want to encourage you to ask people about who they are and know who they are rather than just figuring out what label they are. And of course, the caveat to that is that some people really do value the labels that they've self-assigned, and I think we really want to be careful to mirror that language of what people identify as, but not put our own perceptions of what we think those words are onto somebody else. So let me give you some examples about who we're talking about when we talk about transgender people. We're talking about a really wide range of people, a really broad spectrum of people who identify as trans or as previously trans. So we're including some of the following people. So people who are gender nonconforming, or people who may intentionally or not blur stereotypical lines of binary gender, so binary meaning male or female gender. We're talking about people who transition from one gender to another gender. This is what most people think of when they think about transgender people. We're also talking about people who are questioning their gender, who may feel that their gender is not in alignment with the sex that they were assigned at birth or with what they're presenting as in the world. And this questioning can happen at any point in somebody's life. We're also talking about people who don't fit the binary. So people may identify with one or another gender other than male or female, may house their gender identity outside of that binary. we're also talking about people who are gender conforming but have a transgender history. So these are folks who may have transitioned but now live and view themselves as male or female and no longer transgender. We're also talking about people who are multiply gendered. This may be people who live parts of their lives in one gender and then another part of their life in another gender. So this might be from day to day, hour to hour, month to month. And it may include people who identify as more than one gender, so identify as multiple gender identities. And at Forge, we talk about significant others, friends, family, and allies as being included under this broad transgender umbrella because we know that significant others, friends, family, and allies experience rates of violence and experience types of violence that are very similar to transgender people. So sometimes pictures speak a little bit louder than words, and I know that sometimes people get a little bit confused when we talk about trans-feminine people or trans-masculine people. So I wanted to offer some visuals, which I know that everybody is not able to see the screen or is not able to see the images, but the folks that are on the screen right now are people that would be under that trans-feminine umbrella. And you might hear people like who are on the screen refer to themselves as trans women or women of trans history or male to female transsexuals or formerly transgender. So any of those words or hundreds of others they may identify as. So these are folks who were assigned male at birth but don't identify that way anymore and identify in a more feminine way. So the converse of that are folks who are trans-masculine. So you might hear people like the folks that are on the screen right now referring to themselves as trans men or men of trans history or stud or drag king or female to male transgender person. Again, so these are people who were assigned female at birth and who now have a more masculine identity. And then the third level of clarification is around folks who are non-binary or who are agender. And the language associated with this, the images that are on this slide, is shifting really fast, and it's shifted a lot in the last several years, and even more over the last 10 years. So it's hard to keep up with the language, and that's part of why, again, we don't do terms and definitions because the language is so quickly evolving. And this is probably the largest group of trans people are the folks that are gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, or agender. So people who are gender nonconforming or agender may identify sometimes as one gender, sometimes as another, sometimes as neither, sometimes as both, sometimes as any number of things. They may or may not take hormones or do surgery or make legal changes to their name. Lots of variation in this category of folks. So I want to share with you two core principles that we look at when we do training around trans issues and violence. And the first is this concept of the terms paradox. So we really want to recognize that terms are crucial and they show that we reflect and we want to respect our understanding of who people are. We're listening to folks, we listen to their language, and we refer that back to them. We mirror that to show that we are listening and that we're open and we respect who they are. And at the same time, sometimes the words that people use may not tell us what we need to know to provide appropriate services. So an example that I like to use a lot is somebody who may come into your office for therapy and may have health insurance, and their health insurance card has a different name and gender than the name and gender that they are living in and expressing and have told you. And it's really important to interact with that person in the name and gender that they have told you, but it's also really important to make sure that their insurance gets billed correctly, both so that they aren't outed and so that payment happens. So that's a place where the terms are really crucial, but what we really need to know is how to bill their insurance correctly in addition to treating them with respect. The second concept is something that we're going to spend a little bit of time on today, and that's around master status or master status thinking. This concept was put forward in the 1940s by Everett Hughes and then reintroduced in 1954 by Gordon Allport in his book, The Nature of Prejudice. He talked again about how this language was shifting from master status to the label of primary potency. So both of these terms refer to the tendency of people to believe that one label or demographic category is more significant than any other aspect of the person's background, behavior, or performance. How this commonly plays out for transgender people is that sometimes when a provider learns that the client is transgender, they presume that, for example, all medical conditions are related to being transgender, that being trans has caused a sexual assault, that all relationship strains are due to being transgender, that any type of job loss or any other hardship is being caused by their transgender identity. The reality, of course, is that people can have medical conditions that are totally unrelated to being transgender. People can have relationship struggles because they don't communicate well, or people may lose their job because they don't show up. Lots of reasons other than transness. So this concept is going to be especially important in our discussion today because master status thinking, as you can see, could be applied to transness, it could be applied to disability or trauma, and to avoid pigeonholing people and limiting people to only one part of who they are is going to be a very central theme of our time together today. So let's put this master status thinking into action. A little bit more detail about how this plays out, specifically around someone's transgender identity experience or history, is that a provider may prioritize their transness over, for example, their client's sexual assault, which is what the client is actually seeking services for. So oftentimes this translates into a provider being really curious about a person's trans history and experiences. They may express their curiosity through questions, oftentimes invasive or inappropriate questions, that focus on the person's transness. Trans people are frequently asked questions that would usually not be asked of someone who is not transgender, including questions about genitals and their former name and just a lot of things that are not appropriate. Many times professionals will take over conversations and redirect the flow back to the person's transness versus empowering the client to share and direct the conversation and the level of care that they're seeking. This can also play out when a provider correctly or incorrectly makes the decision that the victimization was caused by or is correlated with the person's transgender status. As you can see, this concept of master status could be applied to, again, transness or other variables like disability or trauma or race or age. The options are kind of endless about what it could be applied to. So let me share an example of how master status thinking and mentality shapes interactions between clients and professionals. This is a story about Nicole. Nicole had just left a violent relationship and was seeking help from a very well-known, well-staffed domestic violence agency. She really needed shelter, and she needed shelter right now. And she also needed some other support services around her abuse and staying safe from her partner. Forge received a call from this domestic violence agency, and they were telling us that they had a trans person in their office, and the person was in crisis and they needed help right now. And initially we were like, this is really great that somebody reached out and they were looking for trans-related support for this client. But what we learned was that the agency that was calling us only heard the piece that this person was transgender. So they presumed that because she was transgender, that they should call a transgender agency and they would focus on getting her trans-related help. The reality is that she didn't need trans-related help. She needed help in terms of shelter and safety and support from abuse. So that agency already had the skills to work with this person, and what they ended up doing was focusing on something that was not at all relevant to this person's experience at the moment. So this is just one example of how we can see somebody really not getting the care that they need because somebody else has viewed their transness as most central. So let's move into this next section, and as we do that, let's talk about, let's ask you what kinds of clients you've worked with. So have you worked with clients who are trans and disabled, clients who are trans and survivors of some form of victimization, or all three, so people who are trans, disabled, and a survivor? Great. So I'm seeing a lot of folks have worked with folks who are trans, disabled, and survivors, which is really, really neat to see that. Excellent. So as we move on, we're going to talk about some of those intersections between transness and disability and trauma, and hopefully more of you will be able to kind of check down that list of having more knowledge of all three of those areas. Nearly all of the content that we're going to talk about today and that we are talking about is really focused on those intersections between different types of identities, different experiences, different types of access. You'll hear not only how transness, disability, and trauma intersect, but also other variables that may influence a person's sense of self, their choices for healing, and their resilience. So I wanted to start with one of the two audio clips, and this is a fairly short audio clip, and what we're going to be hearing from, who we're going to be hearing from is Cecilia Chung, who is this really amazing, powerful, wonderful trans activist. She currently is working at the Transgender Law Center as a senior strategist, and she's really this amazing person who's nationally recognized as an advocate for human rights and social justice and health equity and LGBT equality. She's done a lot of work with the San Francisco Human Rights Commission and the Health Commission there, as well as working with trans people who are living with HIV and other chronic illnesses. So what we're going to hear is a short audio clip that points out transness and disability and trauma that are things that don't go away over time. And all three of these intersecting components have long-lasting impacts on people's lives and wellness and happiness. Let's listen to the video.
My name is Cecilia. I am a transgender woman. I came out to my mother in late 1991, and by close to the end of 1992, I decided to live as my true self. By 1993, my family turned their backs on me. I lost my job, had no home to go to, and by the summer of the same year, I tested positive for HIV. For the following 2 years, I was trapped in a nightmare. I was sexually assaulted multiple times, but was afraid to go to the police because I was doing sex work. And I began to self-medicate. I thought that was how my life would end until I was assaulted by 2 men on an August night in 1993. They were trying to sexually assault me. I fought back. They stabbed me, chased after me, and dragged me to the ground and started kicking. Luckily, someone called the police, and they were arrested, and I was rushed to the hospital. My mom came to see me, and we began our reconciliation. In year 2000, I was diagnosed with AIDS. I'm currently on antiretroviral therapy, have my family back in my life, but still I cannot shake off all that had happened to me. I am still having the same dreams that I was trapped in a burning house with no escape. My boyfriend often hears me crying and screaming in my sleep. And to me, that manifests into depression and a sense of hopelessness. That sense of hopelessness when I absolutely have no reason to feel that way. I am still seeing a therapist after all these years, and I don't know when my nightmare will ever end.
So Cecilia's very short story really helps remind us that trauma is complex, and there's a lot of complexity within each of us. She also reminds us that healing from trauma can take a very long time, sometimes even a lifetime. As people who work with people with disabilities, people who experience trauma, I'm certain that we all want to make a difference in the lives of our clients. We want to empower them, and we want to help them move along in their healing journey, however far they want to go or they're able to go. For some, our job might be to simply witness and listen and validate their experiences and their realities. So today, as we explore these three overlapping areas of transness, disability, and trauma, I want to continue to remind us that there may be some correlations or causations between these areas, or they may be totally separate and distinct in terms of correlation and causation. At the same time, when we work with people as whole and complex and multi-experiential types of people, it's going to be very difficult to isolate one aspect of who a person is without acknowledging the different parts of who they are, different components of their experiences, their everyday living, and how that all impacts the totality of their humanness. So let's take a moment and talk a little bit about where there's some substantial overlap in the lives of people who are trans and people who live with disabilities. 22% of trans people were denied the use of a restroom at work. You might be thinking, what do restrooms have to do with trauma and stuff? But I think you'll see it in a second about how this kind of plays out. But so these 22% of trans folks were denied the use of a restroom at work. They weren't allowed to use the bathroom that aligned with their current gender identity and expression. So when we think about people that are living with disabilities, how many people that live with disabilities cannot access a restroom? Are all bathrooms accessible? Are they accessible to one person that has a certain kind of disability that might need grab bars or a larger size stall, but that bathroom might not be accessible to somebody who has sensitivities to scents or chemicals? Are the bathrooms that people are supposed to be using in the same building that they work in? A lot of times we see with trans people that the bathroom that they're supposed to use is in a different location that they have to walk to. And the same is true for people with disabilities, that the bathroom may not be easily located. So we anticipate that the rates for how people can access restrooms is probably going to be very similar between trans people and people living with disabilities. So if we compare something else, if we compare inappropriate questions, we know that around 41% of trans people are asked inappropriate or invasive questions. And oftentimes these questions focus on things like surgical status or their realness, and big scare quotes there, and their realness as a man or a woman, so in this really binary sort of way. A lot of times trans folks are asked questions about how they have sex or other very, very personal questions. And again, how many people with disabilities have been asked inappropriate or invasive questions? The inappropriate questions generally with people with disabilities also tend to focus on bodies, how bodies work, what bodies are capable of doing. Questions that wouldn't typically be asked of people who are not living with disability. So again, I think these rates are going to be fairly similar for trans people and for people living with disabilities. If we look at things like the visibility of people who are trans or people who are disabled, we come up with some interesting things. So when someone is visibly trans, their rate of violence is 2 to 8 times higher than those who are not visibly trans. And I want to note here that this assessment of people, in questioning if they are trans or non-trans is a really dangerous slippery slope. So this concept is rooted in this ideology that there are two genders and that much of society tries to fit people into one of those two categories. So it's a really dangerous thing for us to do. When someone doesn't align with those societal expectations of male and female, they're often at increased risk of violence and harassment and discrimination and other forms of very unpleasant things, and oftentimes very dangerous or fatal things. When others can see something about somebody that they perceive to be different, there tends to be higher rates of violence. So again, when we look at people living with disabilities, when those visibilities are different, visible to others, are those people at more risk for increased violence and vulnerability? I think generally the answer is yes. So let me ask you what you think. I've just given a couple of examples between the similarities between trans people and people living with disabilities. So we talked about barriers to accessing restrooms, being asked invasive questions, and increased violence when transness and disability are visible. So what else do you think is similar between people who are trans and people who are disabled? So you can all type in if you're accessing by computer. So people are writing in feeling alienated and alone. People feel marginalized. Similarities are marginalized or stereotyped. Depression. Few protections under the law. Stigma. Excellent. Inaccessibility to competent services. So people feeling pity or people assuming that something's wrong with you. Lack of community inclusion. Constantly having to explain disability or transness. Excellent. So sympathy versus empathy. Great. So oftentimes left out of advocacy services, or they aren't seeing themselves in the services. Somebody else writes, history of medical establishment not respecting your autonomy and self-determination, trying to fix or cure you. Those are excellent. Excellent, perfect. Thank you for participating in that. So here's another one of the Esparvo photos. And I was thinking about this as we were setting up this PowerPoint of how to accurately describe some of these images, and it's really hard for me to describe some of the beauty of trans people, but this person is heavily tattooed and standing in front of a brick wall, and he has this most beautiful smile. All right, so let's move on and talk about some more data. We shared a little bit of data. I'd like to share some violence prevalence data, and then we'll talk about the intersections around disability and violence. So some of the data sources that the information is going to be coming from today are the National Center for Transgender Equality's Injustice at Every Turn, which was a very large survey in 2011. We're going to share a little bit of data from the Centers for Disease Control, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. Many of you have heard of that. And then we have data from 3 of our different studies that we've done in the last 10 years. Let me start by kind of framing what's going to be on the next few slides with this quote from the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. It was a survey that had over 6,400 trans people, and it highlights some of the pervasiveness of the trauma and hardship in trans people's lives. So the quote says, transgender and gender nonconforming people face injustice at every turn, in childhood homes, in school systems that promise to shelter and educate, in harsh and exclusionary workplaces, at the grocery store, the hotel front desk, in doctor's offices and emergency rooms, before judges, and at the hands of landlords, police officers, healthcare workers, and other service providers. So we're only going to talk about a very small amount of data around the violence that trans people experience. We have many other webinars that I encourage you to look at that will go into greater detail about specific types of data. So let's look at first just some general categories of violence. So based on multiple studies, it's commonly believed that over 50% of trans people have experienced sexual violence at some point in their lives. Some of the surveys are showing upwards of 60, 70, 80% of trans people experiencing sexual violence. If we compare this to the general U.S. population, where 1 in 3 girls or women or 1 in 6 boys or men experience sexual violence. It's important to note here, too, that non-trans people living with disabilities experience higher rates of sexual violence than people without disabilities. It's highly likely that trans people who are living with disabilities are going to have higher rates than this 50 to 66%. In a survey that we conducted in 2004, we asked sexual assault survivors if their gender was a contributing factor. And so this was obviously a subjective measure, if they thought it was a contributing factor. And as you can see on the screen, 43% thought that their gender was a contributing factor in their sexual assault. It does mean that more than half thought that it wasn't or weren't sure if it was. So again, that goes back to causality or correlation. So rates of intimate partner violence or domestic violence is roughly the same for people of all gender identities and people of all sexual orientations. There's some new research that's suggesting that there's higher rates within trans communities or lesbian, gay, bi people, but we don't really have a lot of conclusive data yet. This chart is added not to show prevalence rates of each of these categories, but to help solidify the concept that trans people experience multiple forms of violence, abuse, and assault across their lifespan. This data is from a 2011 study that Forge conducted. We had 1,005 valid transgender respondents, and of the people who responded to experiencing victimization, this chart shows how many had more than one types of victimization that they experienced. So So if we look at things from the bottom up, we asked people to check a box, and it was kind of a throwaway demographic question that turned out to be really valuable. So check the box if people had experienced childhood sexual abuse, adult sexual assault, dating violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, or hate-motivated crimes. So as you can see, many, many people experienced 2 or more types of these types of victimizations. This slide might be slightly surprising to some of you who have maybe a little bit more trans knowledge. What we oftentimes hear is that trans women experience more violence than trans men. And when we first analyzed the data, we were really surprised by the data that's on this chart. We thought our numbers might have been wrong, so we had our data analyst rerun the numbers many, many times to make sure that our survey respondents and our analysis of it was accurate. So when we had this preconception that trans feminine individuals were at higher rates of violence, we really questioned this data because, as you can see on the slide, many of the categories have trans men or trans masculine people actually experiencing higher rates of violence. We do want to acknowledge that trans women do have and continue to experience high rates of hate-motivated violence, so particularly street-based violence, and a lot of the murders that we're hearing about of transgender people have been almost exclusively transgender women and transgender women of color. But again, when we're looking at these more intimate forms of violence, so not street-based violence, we're seeing that trans men or trans masculine folks are experiencing the same or higher rates. Let's look at transness and disability combined. So when we looked at multiple different studies, we found that between 31 and 43% of trans people have reported living with at least one or more disability. And this compares to roughly 20% of the general population that reports living with disability. So that can mean that over twice as many trans people are living with disabilities as non-trans people. We could speculate as to why this is, but perhaps you'll draw your own conclusions and guesses by the time we're through today. When we surveyed folks in 2004, we asked people if they lived with disabilities and how many disabilities they lived with. And you can see that 53% reported that they had one disability, one medical condition that they considered a disability. But 47%, the rest of that, said that they had 2 or 3 or more disabling conditions that they were living with. So many people have multiple conditions that they're struggling with or challenged with every day. We also wanted to know about what types of disabilities that transgender people were living with. And as you can see on the slide, nearly half the people reported having a mental health condition. Around a third had physical conditions or injuries that were really wide-ranging. So conditions that fell into this category included things like chronic back pain, debilitating migraines, cerebral palsy, arthritis, heart disease, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, things along those lines. We also broke out the autoimmune and endocrine conditions because they were the highest cited of the physical disabilities. We noted that 14% had endocrine conditions. So some of those were autoimmune conditions like fibromyalgia and lupus, multiple sclerosis, or chronic fatigue syndrome. Interestingly, 4% of respondents classified being transgender as being a disability. There have been a lot of shifts in how we look at transness over the last 10 years. For example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual has changed the diagnostic label from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. So there's some shift in how people think about transgenderism and if it's a disability or if it's a medicalized condition or not. One thing that we're seeing more and more that since the time of 2004 is we're seeing a lot more both in general society and within the trans community higher rates of conditions like autism and Asperger's and other non-neurotypical conditions. We're also noticing that there are high levels of individuals who are experiencing acute sensitivity to chemicals or scents, lights, sounds, or other kinds of sensory input. So I'm not sure if what's happening in the trans community is just mirroring what's happening in the general population. So mental health care against somebody's will, receiving mental health care against a person's will isn't a disability, of course, but it does indicate that some people are treated as if they had a mental health condition, when in reality their mental health may be actually quite fine and quite healthy. So in 2004, again, the study that we did, we found that 9% of the transgender respondents had indicated that they had received mental health services against their will. This statistic can be particularly important when comparing it to the rates of violence trans people experience and the relationship between healing and access to mental health care services. Individuals who had been forced into receiving mental health services might be far less likely to be proactive in seeking mental health care following an abuse or an assault, or for any other reason to seek mental health care. It's also really common for people with disabilities to be hospitalized or receive care against their will for reasons that are not related to their actual mental health, but might be based on other people's lack of understanding or pathologizing their experiences that don't really require medical management or medical care. So let's shift and talk a little bit about some long-term physical and mental health implications of things that we might want to look at today. The meta-analysis data presented in the Healthy People 2020 Transgender Health Fact Sheet reported that between 21 and 64% of trans people lacked health insurance. These numbers were supported by that really large transgender study that I talked about before, the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. They noted that 19% of their survey respondents did not have health insurance compared to 17% of the general population. Uninsured rates increased dramatically for people of color, for youth, for other marginalized populations. These rates probably have improved over the last couple of years with the Affordable Care Act making insurance more available to a greater number of people. So these numbers may be shifting in the last couple years. Medical and mental health care directly following a victimization can be really expensive, and the care that happens years and months later after an incident can also be really expensive if somebody doesn't have health insurance. So for many people who don't have access to medical care or mental health care, they may not be receiving the services that they need, and their healing may be very, very slow, and their care may be even unattainable. When trans people do have health insurance or they have access to health care through a healthcare provider or a clinic, they're often literally denied medical care when they walk in the door because they're transgender. So 1 in 5 transgender people have been denied care. Due to being denied care when they needed it, or knowing of friends who have been denied care, many won't seek out care, both medical care or mental health care, when they need it for any reason. This can be really critically important if somebody is also living with a disability, especially if that disability might benefit from regular monitoring or through treatment. So in addition to being denied care, trans people have also experienced high rates of sexual and physical assault within medical settings. Upwards of 10% of trans folks have experienced being sexually assaulted in a healthcare environment. So that's 1 in 10 trans people is being sexually assaulted in a healthcare setting. Really substantial. 26% are being physically assaulted, again, in that healthcare setting. So when we look at these numbers, it's no wonder that trans people may not be accessing medical care, or they may have a really deep distrust of medical or mental health providers. Again, unchecked, unmonitored, or untreated physical or mental health conditions often get worse over time. So it's important to try to break the cycle of violence and barriers and that warranted mistrust so people can access the care that they need. So I wanted to broaden our scope for just a minute and talk about the ACE study, which many of you, I think, know about, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. The ACE study had over 17,000 subjects and looked at whether and how many adverse childhood experiences, including physical and sexual abuse and neglect, individuals had compared to their health stats as an adult. The result was an extremely strong correlation between how much trauma a person experienced as a child and how many health challenges they had as a result. The pyramid on the screen represents how the researchers explained their findings. They believe that childhood trauma disrupts the neurodevelopment, which can then lead to social and emotional and or cognitive impairment. Those impairments cause social friction, which leads to people adopting health risk behaviors such as using alcohol or drugs or smoking. And then those in turn raise the risks of disease and disability and social problems and ultimately can result in premature death. So if you don't know about the ACE study, I really encourage you to go to the cdc.gov/ACE website and check out more details. I wanted to show just a couple of the health risks that increase with childhood trauma, and in particularly, I wanted to show the ones that trans people seem to be experiencing at more pronounced rates. So things like alcohol and drug use or abuse, smoking, depression, suicide attempts, heart disease, health-related quality of life, and sexually transmitted diseases or HIV. So those are some of those things that the ACE study found, and when we look at trans populations, those are things that are really common there as well. So when we look at the long-term implications of violence, we're moving back into trans-specific data now. Again, this is from our 2004 survey, and we asked survivors if they had any long-term implications related to their health based on the trauma that they experienced. And the slide shows that 15% reported having permanent physical scarring as a result of the sexual abuse that they sustained. So that could have been something like a lot of times people are cut or have words carved into their bodies or have other things that relate to like broken bones or other things on their skin that may have been a physically scarring event. 10% had long-term medical conditions following abuse or assault. So some of those folks didn't end up calling those long-term medical conditions a disability, but 4% of survey respondents said that they had long-term disabilities as a direct result from the violence that they experienced. So that's fairly high, I think. We've not been ever able to find data that is around non-trans populations to know if these stats are similar or not. So I'd like to share two more pieces of long-term data before we move to the next section. The first one is about HIV. And again, HIV is not necessarily a disability, but it's worth noting that trans people have a disproportionately high rate of HIV versus the general population. The general U.S. population has HIV prevalence rates of just a little bit over 0.5%, whereas the trans community has rates that are between 2.6% and 15.3%. And the big range between there really depends on such variables like if somebody's unemployed or not. So unemployment really raises that rate of HIV infection. And things like surviving through sex work increase that rate fairly dramatically. HIV, of course, can have substantial health impacts, especially if it's not treated. So those trans folks that don't have insurance or are living at or below the poverty line may make it difficult for them to access HIV-related care or treatment. And the result might be more substantial health challenges, disabilities, or even earlier fatality. And the second piece of the longer-term data that I'd like to share with you is around suicide attempts. And again, the data here is really profound. As you can see, the disparity between how many non-trans people have attempted suicide and those who are trans and attempted suicide are profoundly different. So 1.6% of the general U.S. population has attempted suicide versus 41% of trans people have taken action to end their own lives. There are many reasons for this enormous disparity, some of which could be related to high rates of violence. Some could be due to despair of living in poverty. Some could be related to sustained bullying and discrimination and microaggressions that trans people are facing every day. This chart also shows that people who have experienced sexual assault, and especially those who have experienced sexual assault by teachers in grades K through 12, or physical assault by teachers in grades K through 12, have even higher rates of suicide attempts. So we're going to listen in a minute to another audio clip from a trans survivor. And this clip is a 5-minute clip, so it's a little bit longer. And the clip is just a fraction of an interview that I did with Joe in 2013. And this was part of a webinar that we did on trans and disability. And the URL I will show you on the next screen. You can find the full webinar on our website, as well as this 45-minute interview with Joe in its entirety on our website. So if you're interested in the clip, you might want to listen to the whole thing. This interview with Joe talked about many challenges that he had been experiencing and had been difficult for him, and many of the areas of things that had worked for him in his healing and his wholeness. So I wanted to ask him to share with us some of the things that he really wanted providers to know. And what you're going to hear is that piece of what he wanted people to know. Before we listen to that, Joe is a trans man who has experienced multiple forms of victimization in his life, including childhood abuse by his mother, sexual abuse, intimate partner violence. He also lives with multiple different disabilities. And again, I've selected this piece at the end of the interview that I did with him a couple of years ago about what he most wants providers to remember.
Well, I'm wondering if, as we kind of close and wrap up today, I know you mentioned a couple things before about kind of what you would like providers to know, or what are some of the things that are useful both to you or what you think might be useful to other people who are trans, living with disability, and have experienced trauma?
Sure. To try to keep it somewhat simple, I think there's a few main things. I think one thing, which is true for anyone really, but I think it's especially true when you're trying to support someone in finding their empowerment again, is to focus on someone's strengths, to help them. I know that's helped me the most when I've had a therapist help remind me to look at what's going well and where my strengths are in a situation. That kind of ties into the second one, which is to support their clients in releasing shame, because really what can keep someone, I think, from that feeling of empowerment is also a degree of shame, whether it's shame about being transgender and how someone's currently perceived, or all the things that can come with that, or shame about the disability, or shame about the trauma. It's taken me a lot of years to keep realizing that, whatever happened with my mother has a lot to do with her own challenges and very little to do with me, and to get to some perspective and context of just letting the shame go, and just, it's a story. It's just a fact at this point in my life of what I lived through and what informs me. But it doesn't have to mean something about me. It doesn't have to mean I don't get to have a good life and good relationships now.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think it kind of tied in with those things, because to me, I think we need to, continue to get away from that victim model. I think there's a time to feel the feelings and move through the victimization of something, but to really move into a way to connect in the world that works for the person. I'm still working on that somewhat for myself, trying to find, since I'm not currently able to work, what I'd ideally like is someday to have enough support around me that I could work a job again, at least part-time, but I need a lot of support and I need a lot of flexibility. But even separate from that, I've been able to start to find some art classes to at least jump into. I don't go every week, I don't go all the time, but some way to break down. I think there's this feeling of disenfranchisement and this feeling of alienation that someone who's transgender or transsexual might have felt, say growing up in this culture at this point. In most cultures, there can be a feeling of isolation if someone isn't allowed to transition at a more natural time frame. I think there's this disconnect that can happen, and the more we can find a way to connect in the world, I think that just helps with that builds on the strengths, because it doesn't do me a whole lot of good to maybe I'm good at something, but if it's more of a weakness or something I don't enjoy, that's not actually going to help get me out of the depression or the PTSD as much as for me going to an art event, or I've been able to connect in with things that really inspire me and get me excited, and I have something better to think about at night when I go to sleep, and hopefully I won't have the nightmares.
Right. Right.
Because of that, right?
Yep.
Versus just volunteering somewhere just to be busy.
Right.
Which I don't think is as helpful.
So it's almost even talking
Those
about
are some of my things.
making meaning in your life, so connecting to the world in a way that's
Yeah.
meaningful to you, yeah.
Right, and I think it includes some self-awareness, which again I think comes from the strengths. The more I get more, it's almost like I heard someone use this analogy, but it's like the strengths can be like a knife, and we're sharpening that knife by building the strength so that we can get better and better and better at the part that we love to do the most. And so I'm still working on, finding out where that is, but I'm getting closer, and it feels like that also helps the health part because, obviously the neurotransmitters, everything is improved when I'm doing something that I connect with and has meaning for me.
Mm-hmm. That makes so much sense.
Is there more you want to add to that? I mean, I feel like there's probably things I'm missing on that list, but...
Well, I think, I was interested in what you had to say about it, because, I mean, that's why we're talking, is to hear what you have to say about it. And I just, I'm kind of struck by, I think that the three things around, empowerment and building and focusing on strengths, definitely kind of crosses all of the three, the trans, the disability, and the trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and so does the shame. I mean, there's so much shame that people feel around transness or bodies, around disability and bodies, or mental health issues, or around trauma, and it's like, so working on that shame is another just vital piece. And then, I think the third part that you were talking about, and I know you were kind of talking about it in terms of like getting away from a victim model and connecting in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and I heard a lot of pieces in there about kind of making meaning and kind of finding a purpose and not just being busy for the sake of busy. And again, I think those are the touch.
So that got slightly clipped off, but I think that's a really interesting audio clip, and again, it's just the last 5 minutes of this really rich interview that I did with Joe 2 years ago. So I encourage you to take a look at the entirety of it and listen. He has a really beautiful way of telling stories, and there's some really, really amazing information in the interview. So let's head for one more Esparvo picture before we do some reminders. I say a lot of times that this photo is my favorite, but for folks who aren't able to see the screen, this is this amazing woman who I do happen to know, who's in this really funky bookstore, and her hand's up against the poetry section. She's just fantastic. So before we head into questions, I wanted to do several reminders and resources just to give folks some things to think about going home and things to potentially look up later on. So if we scroll back to the beginning of our time together today, we talked about this concept of master status, or the label of primary potency. So just as a reminder, the goal is not to be trapped in that label of primary potency, but rather to have a both-and way of looking at issues and people. So this is relevant for transness and disability and trauma. And again, if we look very back to the beginning of our time together, we talked about the terms paradox. So the terms that people use are really crucial, and we want to mirror their language to be respectful and show that we're listening and caring and accepting and open. And yet the words that they use might be meaningless in terms of what we need to do to provide accurate and helpful care to them. So we might need to ask some very sensitive questions to get more information. When interacting with clients, we didn't talk about this a lot, but it's really important to remember to ask people what their name and pronouns are. So we recommend doing something really simple, like when you're first meeting somebody, saying something like, hey, hi, my name is Michael, and I use he, him, and his pronouns. What name and pronouns would you like me to use for you? And so the key points to remember, it's important to ask what people use for their name and pronouns, and then to listen to their response, and to listen really carefully to any nuance that there might be in their response, and of course to remember what they said, and then to consistently use their name and pronoun that they've shared with you. So we talked about bathrooms a couple of times, and transgender people oftentimes face harassment and discrimination or violence in restrooms. Having a safe bathroom environment for trans clients is a really important part of helping trans clients feel welcome and comfortable in your office space, in your building, wherever it is that you're meeting with them. Having bathrooms that are both accessible to trans people and people with disabilities is also incredibly important to creating an environment that's both welcoming and is literally available and accessible to them. We know that sometimes agencies are in buildings that they rent or that they don't own and they can't exactly remodel and have all gender restrooms or unisex or single stall rooms. And because of that, we know that isn't always possible. So we encourage folks to have signage that lets people know that people are using the bathroom that they feel most comfortable in and that aligns with their gender. So having signage around that supports people to use the bathrooms that are appropriate for them is really validating and helpful to everybody. One of the things that we didn't talk about, but I think you've heard throughout, were things around invasive questions and things like that. And I really, really, really think that a curiosity is really amazing. It's an amazingly good thing. When we're curious, I think it shows that we are listening and thinking about things. We're investigating. We're trying to attend to what somebody is saying, or we're trying to experience with them with one of our senses or all of our senses. And I think that we can be better providers and better service agents when our mind is very curious and very attentive. And where we get into trouble is when our mouths get into action before our brains can say, hey, maybe we shouldn't ask that question. So I think curiosity is great when it can be controlled and not spoken as much or spoken in ways that are a little bit more careful. So like we've talked about before, trans people have historically been asked inappropriate and invasive questions, and oftentimes those questions are about surgical status and genitals and history and a lot of things that have nothing to do with the support that they're seeking right now. Similarly, people that are living with disabilities are also asked invasive and inappropriate questions, again, usually about bodies and things that have little to do with what they're seeking care for right now. So when someone has just experienced an acute episode or a victimization, when they're seeking care right then or months later, it's not the time that they want to be trying to educate somebody or trying to make sure that they don't get asked those invasive questions. So I know that we want to serve trans survivors and trans survivors with disabilities, and to do so we need to be really mindful of our own education and what we ask people so that they can get the services that they need. So if we can stay focused on their needs and what they're there for, it's a win-win for everybody. And so that really leads into staying focused. So survivors who are trans and living with a disability will greatly benefit if we can all focus on these three things. One is listening, the second one is believing, and the third is being present. So those are things that are really good for working with anybody. But if you can do those three things, we're likely not going to be making excuses like saying, well, that you don't know enough about transness or disability or whatever the issue is. And it won't give unnecessary explanations. So spending the client's time while you're processing out loud, or making things more complicated by believing that, who the client is just too much for you to handle. So by staying focused, listening, believing, and being present, we're going to be able to serve our clients better. Having transgender or LGBT materials in your waiting area, literature racks, or anywhere out in public if you have a brick and mortar office is really important in helping clients feel welcome and included. And I know that offices oftentimes don't have a lot of space to put materials out, but I wanted to let you know that we have not geographically specific materials that we would be happy to send you. So feel free to contact us and just tell us what you'd like and how many you would like of them, and we would be more than happy to send it. One is, a brochure that's very user-friendly and very accessible to people. We have bookmarks. We have lots of things that we can send you that will help send the signal that you're very open and willing and wanting to serve trans survivors. I encourage you to know what resources are available, and I'm not trying to be self-promoting, but Forge is one of very few agencies that are producing trans-based and survivor-based materials. The images that are on the screen right now are two of our most recent survivor-focused guides. They're both about 150 pages long. They're very in-depth, but they're also very accessible. So I encourage you to know about them and read them if you have time, and to be able to share them with your trans clients. So one is on how to find a therapist, that's trans and trauma informed, and the other one is a self-help guide to healing and understanding around sexual assault. I want to remind people, too, to keep learning. I think no matter how much we know, it's always important to keep learning. So we welcome you to, learn more from our website and our 50 hours of free webinar training, and learn more from Vera's webinar trainings that are archived. Learn more in any way that you can, because it's really important to keep on expanding our knowledge and our repertoire of what we have in our brains and how we can then allow our head to more easily work with the people that we're serving. I wanted to remind us of the things that Joe talked about. Joe captured these points, I think, very, very well. About the first one was to stay focused on the person's strengths and empowerment. The second was to help clients feel and release shame. That shame might be substantially compounded when all three of these components are in place. So when transness, disability, and trauma are all there, it may be really difficult for somebody to not feel shame. So how can we help people release that shame? And the third is around helping clients create meaning in their lives by helping them connect. So connect maybe to themselves, to their bodies, to another person, to art, to music, to a higher power, to anything that feels connecting and meaningful to them. And I wanted to end before we do some questions with this last Esparvo photo, which has an amazing quote on it that says, "Together we help each other heal." And it's three people that were photographed on the East Coast this last year. So I am very open to questions. We've got about 10 minutes, and I'm hoping that our Vera folks can help us scroll through and screen some questions. And I think the area for people to ask questions is probably on the right side of the screen. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. If you have a question that you would like to ask at this time, please use the questions or technical assistance box, the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. Type in your question, and we can read it off for Michael. The first one we have actually is wondering if you have any of your materials in plain language that would be accessible to deaf individuals.
That's a good question. I'm not sure that the answer is yes to that, but that is definitely something that we should really be considering and thinking about, and I would love to talk to people that would be able to help us do some of that.
Great. Are there any further questions? Michael's information is also up on the screen, his email address there, and so you can also use that to ask any questions of him. We will also have a link on the next page as we end here that can connect you to the Forge website, where you can access a lot of the information that was presented here today. So I'll leave it open for a few more minutes if people would like to ask a question.
And I know it sounds like you all are sending out the PowerPoints, which is great. And if people would like it in a different format, I'm more than happy to send them out in whatever format you'd like. And I know that our PowerPoints do have a pretty good transcript on it, as well as the transcript that was captured in the captioning pod.
Yeah, we have one more question here. We have the 9% of forced mental health care. Is that an institutionalization or court-ordered therapy?
Well, we didn't ask specifics of it. From the narrative comments that were associated with that question, it was more that it was institutional, like parents putting their kids in a hospital because there was gender nonconformity or because there was depression. I don't believe any of them mentioned being court-ordered at all, but I don't know that for sure because we didn't ask. We do know that a lot of trans kids, this is more true of years ago than it is today, were hospitalized or received other outpatient treatment against their will. So I think that's shifting as we become more aware as a society, but I don't think they were court-ordered.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I'm going to move into our final screen here. Thank you, first of all, Michael, so much for being here with us today. This is invaluable information and really just adds to actually, I'm going to pause for a moment. I think I missed a couple of other questions. So I'm just going to go back to the question moment if nobody minds. So we wanted to know about there was a questions about whether intersectionality, whether there had been any surveys that looked at ethnic groups, for example. There was no mention. They just pointed that there was no mention that some of the surveys did some of this intersectionality. Can you comment on that, Michael?
Yeah, I can a little bit. I know, I mean, what I presented today didn't show a lot of different intersectionalities. I was really trying to focus just on these three major areas. So I don't think any of the slides brought in race or religion or ethnicity or, you know, some of the other variables. I don't think we talked about age either. So some of the surveys have done explicit breakouts based on race, like the National Transgender Discrimination Survey that has the 6,400 people in it. It's an amazing survey with amazing results. You can read 200 pages worth of results of it. But they also did some really nice, like I think they're like 4-page handouts, one on African American trans folks, one on Latino trans folks, I think one on American Indian, just in terms of like looking at race with that. And some of our surveys, we've looked a little bit at some of those other variables and how we look at those intersections.
Great. So we had a question about how can we get the brochures you mentioned sent to us?
Yep.
Go ahead.
You can probably the best way to do it is go to our website, which you'll have in multiple different ways, or if you want to scroll back to the previous screen, go to the contact form and just request what you'd like. So if you'd like the main brochure, just tell us what you'd like and how many you'd like, and make sure that you send us your address so that we can actually send them to you, and we would be happy to do that. So forge-forward.org.
So on the screen it says mmunson@forgeforward.org. So you can write that down, and while some people are taking down that information, I'm going to read out one more question we have here. We have someone from a semi-conservative West Texas area, and what is an appropriate method for reaching out or advertising to trans survivors in the community without receiving backlash or hate from the population at large?
Well, I think if anybody had the answer to that, we would solve a lot of our world's problems. Not receiving backlash, that is. I think there's a couple of ways. I don't know where in Texas, but Texas does have some large cities, and what we know is that trans people, and obviously trans people who are survivors, tend to find access and resources in those larger cities, and those larger cities may have things like LGBT newspapers or other community centers. And so I would encourage looking for the nearest large city that has a community center or a newspaper and thinking about advertising in those locations. So you're really targeting advertising in those places. It's not a perfect answer, but a lot of the backlash probably won't come if you outreach in those communities themselves. I don't think there's any answer for how to not receive backlash, and that's kind of sad and kind of unfortunate. And I'm sorry, that's not a very satisfying answer.
Yeah, we've got a couple more minutes here. We have a question from inside of Vera just asking, what have you heard about the trans community response around the murders that have been occurring lately?
Yeah.
And, what are maybe a response that, in supporting people who are adversely affected just by being in the trans community? How can we maybe support them?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, and it's something that we're looking at a lot, because trans murders are definitely getting a lot of press and a lot of visibility, and it's scaring a lot of people, and people are experiencing secondary trauma because they're hearing about so many deaths, and people are spreading misinformation about how old people live, and which is a very short age, and they're really becoming afraid. And I think a lot of times what we're not doing is we're not validating that fear. So I think it's really important to validate the fear that, you know, there are some really publicly known trans murders right now in our, you know, world this day. And I think it's also really important to make sure that we continue to focus also on people who are experiencing other types of victimization, because what we're seeing is happening is that the murders are the only thing that are being talked about. So the trans men who are not the trans women getting murdered are being silenced, or the people who are white are being silenced, or the people who have experienced sexual assault are being silenced. So I think it's the both and of really validating and acknowledging that the murders are happening, and also making room and space for those other voices to talk about their experiences. Really good question.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
Just being conscious of people's time here this afternoon, we're going to go to our last screen and wrap it up. We just would ask for those of you who are still on with us to take a moment and complete our webinar evaluation by going to the box below the main screen here that says, the words say, please take a moment to fill out a brief evaluation survey about today's webinar. If you click on those words and then click Browse To, it will take you to that evaluation survey. We do rely heavily on these surveys to know what is going well about these presentations and how we better can meet your needs as the people who attend our webinars. You can also download a copy of the presentation, and there are some links and additional resources where you can go, which includes the third one down includes Forge's Empowering, it says Forge Empowering Healing Connection. If you click on those words and click again Browse To, it will take you to their website. We also have our End Abuse of People with Disabilities website. I will leave this screen open for everybody who's still on and would like to access some of this information. We'll leave this open for about 10 minutes for you to access some of this information. But we will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone with a lot of this information in it and how to get a hold of Michael. So thank you all for being on here today. And Michael, thank you so much for being present with us.
Thank you.